Next, from Chicago, from the Illinois Association of School Boards annual conference, we sit down with 4 state education leaders and talk about issues affecting Illinois education. We'll hear from Roger Eddy, the executive director of the Illinois Association of School Boards, and Brent Clark, the executive director of the Illinois Association of School Administrators, among others, as they talk about the process of implementing the new school funding formula, the effects of the Every Student Succeeds Act, and the increasing need for new safety measures in schools. This runs about 45 minutes.
If you're watching online, welcome, and we are in Chicago at the Hyatt for the conference on educational issues, and we're joined by the leadership of all the different associations, the primary education associations. So Jason Leahy with the Illinois Principals Association, Mike Jacoby at the Illinois Association of School Business Officials, Dr. Brent Clark with the Illinois Association of School Administrators, and Roger Eddy with the Illinois Association of School Boards. And this, if you don't know, it could be thought of the management side of education. So Mike's membership would handle the, I often think, Mike, it's interesting, you know, the amount of dollars that go through schools, people, you know, millions of dollars that go through a school, and you don't think about that. You think, you take your school life as a child and extrapolate that, and you never had to think about the money that it takes to run those schools. So why don't we start with you, just as far as trending issues in education. Obviously, we went all these different years, recent history of the school, and sometimes getting funded, not knowing if you're going to get funded. We just went through the whole school funding formula. I'm sure you all want to kind of give a little thoughts on that. But Mike, since we're talking money issues, why don't we open with you? What does the school funding formula mean to your organization, to the running of schools, and from your perspective? And maybe let's, before we get into that, just where are we now? Because we were kind of starving a lot of institutions almost out of life. Where are we now as far as cash flow to the schools?
Well, so some state funding has started to flow. That started to come in September, basically equivalent to what you received last year. So the new funding model has not been actually articulated to the new monies yet. So it's $350 million in that new funding model is not yet coming out to the schools. So we're kind of in a waiting game for that. Some estimates say maybe January, but it could be later. Nobody is quite sure about that. In the meantime, State Board of Education is going through a process where they're verifying enrollment data for the past 3 years with school districts, because this being the foundational year of the new funding formula, everything will be related to this year, because that becomes the base funding for the whole formula. So once that verification process is done, which we anticipate by the end of December, that'll be all wrapped up. Then the State Board of Education should be able to do the final runs on those numbers and send those requests for distribution to the comptroller.
And I'll say this, Dr. Clark and I recently did an interview that probably ran about 15 minutes. Each of us could go in the weeds on this a long time. We'd have a day-long seminar,
Right.
but we got about 40 minutes, so we'll hopefully maybe be able to hit the highlights of some of these issues. Dr. Clark, then, as far as you're concerned, again, you're doing, one of the things, too, you got to do, maybe I'll jump off money for a moment, you also have to do, what, ESSA, and you got a lot of different things for your administrators to have to pick up on, and you're going, I think, through quite a lot of series of seminars to educate the educators, right?
Yeah, we're in the process now of building a sequential set of workshops that will start in January, the first week of January. All of January will be focused on the evidence-based model that Dr. Jacoby was just talking about. We'll do 11 of those across the state. That's to drill deeper for superintendents and school business officials to drill deeper to understand how does this actually work, what does it mean for my district, and how am I going to be expected to spend the money. In February, we're coming back with a second workshop, which will be geared and focused around what's known as ESSA, the Every Student Succeeds Act, which is a federal law that affects every state, particularly Illinois. And then in March, we're coming back with the third sequence of asking districts to come and learn how to write their district's plan as it relates to their spending components from the evidence-based model and the accountability piece from the ESSA. So 3 pieces to that: learn about EBM, learn about ESSA, come back, put it in practice, and start to write your district's spending plan and accountability plan going forward. So lots of things are changing on the accountability side and the funding side for all school districts in Illinois.
Jason, on the principals end, are you dealing with ESSA? What issues are you focused on?
Well, that will be one of them. Obviously, any of these issues trickle down to the principalship, either directly or indirectly. I think, you know, what's interesting about ESSA, and I appreciate the work IASA is doing to work to get superintendents up to speed, and I'm sure we'll look to grab onto some of that and try to figure out ways of getting our members up to speed. But, you know, ESSA is still in play in terms of its development right now. We've got early childhood indicators that have to still be set, 3 through 8 indicators that still have to be set. So all the pieces aren't totally clear yet with exactly what all the parts and pieces for the ESSA plan will be. Interestingly enough, though, with the plan that Illinois submitted, the Fordham Institute gave Illinois and a couple of other states a perfect score.
Wow.
Related to the ESSA plan, just in terms of the appropriateness of the accountability, working to give school districts as much local control over that, states local control over that as could be, and just making sure that it's not looking at just one standardized test one moment at a time, bringing in student growth measures and a variety of other things like that. But probably first and foremost on my members' minds, Terry, and I'm sure these guys will have some thoughts on this as well, probably more than anything is what's happening in the classroom related to the lack of teachers. You know, in the state, we currently have over 2,000 positions open. We're seeing something I never thought we would see, which is we're having schools struggling hiring elementary teachers and PE teachers of all things. And so
I heard that last year, and I was surprised to hear it. I mean,
Yeah.
I'm the guy on the street, the average Joe. I'm not dealing with this, and I was surprised. Teachers and substitute teachers.
Correct. Yeah, both of those are a problem. Anytime I'm in a meeting with a large number of principals, I always ask the question, how many of you have substitute taught or covered a class in the last week? And usually every time over half the room raises their hands because they're not finding enough subs. So we've got a variety of issues, because no matter what we do with funding and ESSA, though those are 2 critically important topics, if we don't have educators in the classroom to teach our kids, all this other stuff's really for naught.
Yeah. Roger, as the head of the Illinois School Board Association, you know, one of the things that always struck me, and I'd like people to note, I think it's one of the greatest examples of civic virtue that all these people join school boards and they're not compensated. The amount of work that they must put in for their individual schools, coming here, and all the workshops that you all put on, and what we're talking about, you all have to kind of communicate these issues then to those school board members. Just give us an overview. How do you approach that? How do you educate those who run our schools?
Well, I think the key is to make sure that for those folks who are governing a school board, that they understand that governance means to hire good administrators in many cases, set policies, and then really support the implementation of best education practice through their administrators. Sometimes with newly elected board members, understanding that role. Sometimes, you know, you get elected and you think maybe your job is to do or be things that really aren't good governance. So we work very hard from the beginning, and in Illinois there's a law that requires new school board member training on that component to make sure they understand that their role, proper role, is to be involved in the governance and work with and hire a superintendent and then allow that individual to do their job. So on items like ESSA or the funding formula or the teacher shortage, we need board members to be proactively involved in advocating for those issues, but appropriately in the boardroom, passing, you know, policies and making sure that they take actions that will be supportive of the professionals that they've hired to do those jobs.
I've talked over the years with many educators. Something before I ask some specific other policy questions, something I don't really know. You each have your own individual roles. That's why you have different organizations. To what extent do you work together on the issues? I mean, we all have you here, but When you're going after school funding, I would think that's one where you're probably all focused on. You've got the ESSA, as we've talked about. How many of these issues do you work on together collaboratively, and the evidence-based models, another one, the part and parcel of the new funding school? And how is it that you do that? How often do you all kind of pick up the phone or physically get together?
Well, it's as much as needed, and it's been needed a lot. And so even when we were working through the evidence-based model, even though, we had sort of a technical and political side to that we had to handle, we made sure that all of us were involved in the critical kind of directions of that, especially related to, what's in, what's out when we started to get into negotiations with legislators. And it was pretty important for us to have a collective viewpoint on that level. In terms of formal meetings, I think probably about once a month or so, a little bit less than that, where we sit down for half a day and kind of work through all the issues. But that doesn't count all the phone calls that we make.
No, and I would say, we have a formalized relationship called the School Management Alliance. That's the actual banner that we work to collectively under. But I think there's almost a seamless division of labor within the Management Alliance, willingly so, saying, hey, this is your issue, I'll take this one, this is yours, and you just it's kind of like you draft a little bit. Well, you've got a lead runner out there, and then when your issue comes up, okay, you take the lead, and then they can draft, and it's really it's pretty good team effort, because you asked about the economic impact, I think, earlier on.
Right.
It's somewhere around $29 billion in Illinois that goes through the school districts. I don't know what percentage of the gross domestic product that is, but that's a big number, and our job is on that side of managing that. So there's lots of things that the IPA leads on, IASBO, we lead, School Board Association, so it's a shared pool.
What are some of the issues that, when I'd be talking to people about the funding formula, and I talked to Senator Menard about that, and so I got educated on, well, what is it you're basically trying to achieve? And for those who didn't necessarily know, I mean, one of the things that he brought up was, if you're in Chicago here, you've got all kinds, as we look out the window of this room, there's one high-rise after another, and you can have property taxes on that. If you're in an agricultural area, you just don't have hardly any commercial property out there to tax, so you're somewhat at a disadvantage out there, right? Roger, you are from an agricultural area, and we're
Well, look, I think
there.
that was the center of the issue we had with equity in the state, and I think more than anything, the promise and the hope of the funding formula is that we bring equity to funding. There are lots of complicated issues related to counting dollars that are used to levy against, to support school districts, and if you look out the window here
With
and
the
you read
TIF
the stories.
districts you're talking about?
Sure,
Yeah.
and you see 60 cranes in the city of Chicago, that begs a question of whether or not all the economic activity and all the funds are being collected from those, or are they in a TIF district, or are they not in a TIF district, and then there are
Do
the
you guys
agricultural
get to have any
issues.
say on a TIF district being formed?
Well, that was pretty, I think there's going to be discussions, and I think that we'll have people. I know that Dr. Clark and Dr. Jacoby's associations are working with a group they put together. We have an individual on our staff that's worked on that before that we're hoping will work
With
with
what
them.
purpose? I mean, to say, talk with the local schools before TIF district is approved?
No,
or-
there's a task force appointed by the General Assembly. There's 3 members from each of the 4 caucuses. So we want to weigh in with professional and expert testimony on that, with that group, from experiences out across the state. So as I said a couple of days ago, our task force ranges from literally Barrington to Belleville and south and north of both of those. And we'll be weighing in on with that task force. Because to Roger's point about the EAV, you could take a couple blocks right here just outside of the room we're in, and there's probably more EAV in that couple blocks than there are in legitimately several school districts
Right.
that are functioning today.
Or maybe
So-
several counties.
Yeah, well, I don't know about counties, but certainly school districts. So it has to be dealt with at some point.
Well, and then there was a disagreement, a pretty strong disagreement about what should count and shouldn't count.
Right.
When people used to think years ago about TIF, it was something that was associated with economic development and blighted areas. Well, I think this is a good example. We're not exactly in a blighted area in downtown Chicago, but there might be some properties that their EAV isn't necessarily going to support the levy for Chicago Public Schools. So it's a very complicated issue. This gets to your point earlier, and I think how the division of this takes place. Certainly superintendents and business officials have an expertise in this area that we count on from the school board side. And so in those types of situations, they have professionals who deal with this every day that are putting a committee together to look at it and help lead this. And from our standpoint, we want to be there and be supportive with some of our staff and get the word out to our board members and support the work that these guys are going to do to make recommendations to the task force.
Yeah.
You know, again, going back, and this building is filled with people from around the state attending, school board members, again, volunteering their time, getting elected. One, how long does it take, would you say, to educate the board members? Everyone has a learning curve. Some people might, but you got to be a board member for, what would you say, how long, to kind of get your feet on the ground? Because these are a lot of complicated issues we've already, we could drill much deeper in each one of these. And secondly, we've had, it seems like every federal administration comes in, we had No Child Left Behind, now we're talking about ESSA. At what point do both the teachers, the principals, you all in the management say, stop the world, guys, we need to catch up on what we're doing. You're throwing too many reforms at us. If every 3 years we got to have another major reform, at the same time we're trying to just get the basics understood by those who run our schools, is that an issue, or are we inundated with reforms?
A few years ago, I kind of came up with the term. Yeah, well, I call it reform fatigue.
Yeah, well, absolutely.
And we had, and probably to some degree still do, reform fatigue. And one of the symptoms is the statement, oh, here we go again, or here's the next best thing. And you hear it all the time because, you do get tired of having whatever the flavor of the day, and oftentimes politically
And it's both at the Fed and the state level.
and that filters into a district, and that's why local control, and we believe the fact that, those 7 individuals working together with the administrative team make the best decisions for their children, and the most stable districts have a path, and they don't need it changed every few years by whatever comes out of either Springfield or Washington.
Jason Leahy, how hard is it for you to, they hand you the ball and say, here, get this down to the principals, and then they've got to factor it into, I guess, their teachers and work with them?
Well, schools, at every level, everybody's dealing with it, and I think that's part of the value that we have in the Alliance is that fortunately each of our organizations can kind of handle the area that's best suited for them. And I'll just make the statement, and then I'll get to your question, is I think the state of Illinois is very fortunate for this group to work as closely as it does. Each of us attends meetings throughout the country, and there are other states that most of them envy the kind of relationship that we have in the Alliance to tackle these issues, because it's a litany of things. Really, since the economic downturn in schools, you've dealt with new learning standards, new accountability standards, new evaluation standards, new standards for how we handle student discipline, or just to name a few. And any one of those things by itself is very significant and takes a significant amount of time to get up to speed on, implement, and then systemize. But we dealt with these things in rapid fire succession and still continue to. I can't say for sure that we're starting to get a sense of catching our breath, maybe. I think for principals, they would tell you that probably dealing with new teacher evaluation has probably burned up more time than just about anything. Where when I was a principal now over almost 12 years ago, I would really start thinking seriously, though I was in classrooms all the time, but start thinking seriously about the evaluative process when it comes to the paperwork and everything else associated with it, maybe about this time of the year, maybe even more so after Christmas. Now, day one hits and it's on your mind, and you're starting to deal with the administrative logistics of that. And it is quite a arduous process, and one that buries people in frankly a lot of work that may or may not be necessary and frankly good for kids, because it's making adults spend more time on process rather than thinking about what's good educationally for their students.
Let me have you each answer this. In each of your organizations, what's the number one issue or gripe that you get and that you say, boy, if we could fix this, all my membership would be feeling much better? Mike, let's start with.
Well, I would say their first gripe is, we don't know what we have when we have to make decisions. What that means is that you don't know what state funding is going to look like for you, and that you have to make significant personnel decisions without that knowledge. You don't know what your real EAV is when you're filing a levy. You're doing, sort of an
For a
estimate.
bond issue or?
Anything, like if you're doing an estimate on that, so just your general levy. You file your levy before the last Tuesday in December. You usually find out what your actual taxable value is in March. So you're doing everything ahead of when you're getting the data. You have to let go of personnel by law around the first week in April, but you don't know what you're going to get in state funding until the end of June. So it's just this continual guessing game that's going on. And then on top of that, stability. So, in the last 3 years, we've had 3 actually different funding formulas that have come forward. They didn't want to use the old one, so they put in a stop-loss grant, and they did an equity grant. And finally, now they landed on a new funding formula. Well, that just creates, havoc when you're trying to do long-range projections, have some sort of dependable idea on what's coming into the future. And if you don't have a good sense of what kind of framework and foundation you have financially, it's very difficult to meet the educational needs that are coming up and growing and coming every year.
Brent, what about you?
Certainty and stability, 2 words that capture what Mike just described. Our members are in sync with what he's talking about, because while school safety is the preeminent issue we deal with, funding and financial underpinnings to run the operation is next in line. So we're really good at, I think, pretty good at focusing on school safety, but we have no control over the stability and certainty of the financial picture coming at us. That is always the what's your word, havoc? That's that's the havoc that ensues in every school district. And it's unfortunate. It's been that way a long time. We've got a lot of suggestions on how to fix some of that in terms of just moving the dates a little bit.
That's what I was going to ask with Mike. Do you talk to the lawmakers?
Absolutely.
I guess it's about trying to change this.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, you could move a couple dates and change a lot of that where you're making those decisions once you have real data, real understanding in hand. And it makes a lot of sense to do that. On the street, it seems to get into the General Assembly confusion mix, and it hasn't moved yet.
I was trying to think of an appropriate analogy, but it's like trying to close on a house when you don't know what your income is yet. Right?
Or possibly the price of the house.
That's right.
Right. And to what extent is this uncertainty, going back to what Jason brought up, as far as we talked about the schools, trying to teachers, substitute teachers, or the difficulty in hiring teachers, to what extent is this uncertainty a factor in why don't we have enough teachers? Why are people not going either into the teaching profession in Illinois, or maybe they're leaving it?
Well, there's probably a multitude of factors, and I'm sure we can all weigh in on these multitude of factors that have caused us to be at a point of teacher shortage. It's an item that just 5 years ago we were having 50 to 200 people apply for a teaching job, and today now we're saying we don't have any applicants.
Is that right?
So it's a multitude of things. We have beat up the profession over the last 5 to 10 years. We've made fun of the profession. We have changed the retirement security to the point that they now would come in and they would pay more for their pension than their pension is worth, and then they would get to work until they're 67. In order to collect that, it's pegged at Social Security wages. That's the financial side. We've made it very difficult to get into the profession to earn a license. We've made the tripwires in terms of passing tests to get into the profession much, much more difficult, particularly on the mathematics side. And there's a whole host of teaching that doesn't require the strongest math skills. I mean, it doesn't take the strongest math skills to teach a foreign language.
Right.
And we have a desperate need for those teachers. So there's lots of potholes here that have created the teacher shortage. There's not a singular solution that fixes those. It's going to take multiple solutions to address those, to make a pathway for people to come back into the profession.
Roger, for those who don't know, you're a former House member of the Illinois legislature, so when we talk about trying to communicate with the legislature, I presume you sometimes, maybe I'm wrong, have maybe the ear more of some of your former colleagues, but maybe not. But at least you understand perhaps more than the other member here, where those members are coming from. What's the big, if you had a magic wand and could fix one of the problems for your membership, what would it be?
Well, for school board members, it's pretty simple, but it's kind of a large issue, and that's let local board members who are elected locally run their schools. Everybody has a good idea, maybe something that's working in their locale, something that they feel that, boy, this is great, let's do it everywhere. Everyone needs to do what we're doing. So someone will introduce legislation because it's well-intended that everyone do the great things that we're doing. It'll get a little momentum because it sounds really good, and then all of a sudden, 850-plus school districts in the state have a mandate to do something that may not make any sense at all in their district, and it takes away from the local control necessary for those members to make decisions that they think are best. And sometimes it has to do with money, and it's an unfunded or underfunded mandate. Sometimes it just has to do with time and control of employees and resources, which is also taking away local control. So if there is one thing that and we've seen a proliferation of mandates in the last 8 years, and a lot of those have to do with reform groups that in many cases have never been inside a school building to run one, that have the best ideas on how this all should get done.
When we say unfunded mandates, I mean that,
Yep.
I think that goes over some people's heads. Give us some specific examples so that people can get a better handle on that.
Well, I'll give you one. When the General Assembly required the doubling of time for individuals to be behind the wheel in driver's ed and took away driver ed simulators that were being used in suburban school districts had to hire additional personnel, even in rural areas where kids are driving tractors or farm trucks for years before they're 16. There used to be a way that those kids could demonstrate proficiency and only have 3 hours behind the wheel. Well, in one fell swoop, one bill, that doubled. So you had to have 2 times as much labor to perform the same, and you didn't do anything. And they promised
of course,
funding.
they don't give you any money to
Well,
do this,
the
right?
promise was there that there was going to be funding, but it's never come through to the extent of the cost. Underfunding is as bad as unfunded mandates. So, it's difficult. Now, in the last couple of years, we've worked with the General Assembly. I'll give you an example of one, the lead water testing mandate. Nobody wants to sit on the other side of the table and say, we don't think it's a good idea to test water. We're going to oppose this, but help us pay for it. Let's figure out a way that together we can do what's right for kids in this situation. Nobody wants kids drinking water with lead, but let's figure out a way to pay for it, and we did. We worked with the General Assembly, so it was still a mandate, and an important safety mandate, and some of them are very important, but it wasn't unfunded, and it wasn't underfunded. So that's an example of how we can work on those issues, but there's just a great desire by folks who get elected to come up with something and fix a problem that really doesn't exist. Sometimes we have solutions searching for problems, and the politics then gets involved in it too, which really makes it messy.
Well, I often say, once some politicians have a press conference, then they kind of wash their hands of it. They figure they got their day in the sun, and that was good for their political career and showing that they're doing something, but was, as you just said, maybe sometimes these solutions are in search of a problem.
Absolutely.
A problem, I think, is still out there, and one of funding. And this is, too, where the people might say, hey, we've passed this bill now, we got a budget, you guys are paid for, we're all good. One of the problems, Mike, let me say, there's per pupil funding, I guess, and I might be stating this wrong because I'm no expert in school funding, but then you had this thing called categoricals, which is a different level of funding than just the teaching in the classroom, and that might involve things like the money compensation for transportation for school buses. So the money is starting to flow from the passage of the budget, but where are we on in some cases, a school district would be owed millions of dollars in past due categoricals. Where are we in getting the categorical money coming through?
So in the absence of having a school funding formula in place in August, The comptroller made up some time on that, so the third quarter, fourth quarter payments from the prior year were starting to flow. We're still waiting for the final fourth quarter of last year to be distributed to schools this year, and we hope it'll happen before the end of December. But nothing related to categorical payments for this year has been distributed yet. So,
Is that from July 1 when we say
Yep.
this year? Okay.
Yeah. So, we're still behind. I think, part of the borrowing that the state did to deal with sort of the Medicare and Medicaid kind of payments.
And by that, you mean the bonds? We just did about
Bond,
$6
the
billion
$6
or
billion.
so in bonds.
See, none of that comes to the schools. That was all to other providers, and most of those providers were due a percent per month interest on the dollars that they hadn't received from the state. So that was really the priority there. So these other dollars that schools need are still not out, and they're still not coming forward.
Do you guys get interest for monies that
No.
you've been waiting for?
No,
No.
the Prompt Payment Act doesn't affect
No.
public schools or municipalities.
Schools-
12% a year
Yeah.
is the return on that for those vendors.
That's right. So, we're still behind. I think a lot of the hope of a new budget with different revenue sources that eventually will provide resources to hopefully get close to balance will begin to right that ship. Whether or not we get caught up in this year or it takes us a couple of years, I'm not sure. But again, we still got $350 million that's not flowing even on the evidence-based model. So that needs to come too.
There's a backlog of bills and a lot of competition, and I would just say that, we all have advocated with the comptroller's office, and I know ESSA has strongly advocated with Comptroller Mendoza, and it's made a difference. And we appreciate it. We do appreciate it. There's a long line of people knocking at that door, and it's good to have folks in these associations that have relationships and are known. And I know, again, I know that the people I talk to over there hear regularly from the IASA and IASBO folks as well, and all of our alliance. We push them and we say, hey, what about us? Of course, there's a bunch of people behind us in line too that are saying, what about us? And if it's Medicare, Medicaid related, if it's health related, she's got tough decisions to make, but I think she's really tried hard to listen to us. So I appreciate that effort.
I mean, just recently, the backlog of bills went from about $16 billion, we're about $9.5 billion, I think, on unpaid bills. So there's, the thing I would say, that $6 billion that's going to be going back into the Illinois economy, then all that backlog of bills money should have been circulating, it wasn't, which obviously has some ramifications.
Just in the medical field in Springfield, which has a hub of state employees, there were a lot of medical providers, though, that were pretty much leveraged to their hilt
Yeah.
in terms of all they could borrow with all of their assets. And I'm sure a lot of this money that went to those went to pay off that borrowing that they had done, which simply means that the bank made the money on it.
Right.
And
I
that's
talked to
kinda
one
where it was.
dentist, and
Yeah,
he said the
exactly.
state owes me $600,000.
There you go.
One dentist in
Yeah.
Springfield.
Yes.
And,
Yep.
you wonder how they could keep their doors open.
That's right. Well, they borrowed money.
Well, the key to this is this isn't a solution to a problem when you borrow money to pay bills. I mean, but the economic sense or the fiscal sense that it makes is you're paying less in percentage on this borrowed money than borrowing it from the dentist and the doctor and the accumulated borrowing.
We were required to pay about 9 to 12%.
So you're saving that money. It's kind of an arbitrage
It is,
situation.
yeah.
But it's important to really face the fact that that doesn't solve the problem. That's still borrowed money, and we probably still have a structural gap somewhere to fund everything we need to fund. And
We do. One of the structural gaps that's glaring in our budget right now, our state budget, is the way to deal with the pension payments that are coming due.
Right.
And until we're willing as a state, as a General Assembly, as a governor, to get that amortization fixed so that we can afford the payments, even if it extends the payment period, until we're willing to do that, we're going to either always face a structural deficit or have to always look at additional revenues. It makes a lot of sense, at least to this fella, to fix the amortization schedule where we can manage the payment and know we can pay it.
Let me squeeze in one. We're coming down to end of time, but I just came out of a speech here, and there's, for those who've never attended a school board conference, there's basically multiple events going on simultaneously, probably true of any number of conferences. But I just heard a very interesting speaker, and he was talking about school safety. And of course, every parent, we unfortunately hear these events happening. On school safety, and let me have you chirp in on this as a principal, you probably focus on this any number of times. But one of the things he was saying is it doesn't necessarily take a whole lot more money, but you ought to, this expert was saying you need to be able to lock the doors on the inside too. So if there's an event going on in your school, the shooter can't come into your classroom. To what extent, and I tend to think, it used to be the focus would have been a lot of what we're talking about, funding, how much do you need, are we getting our schools? Now we got to think of things that should never be an issue. But to what extent let's start with you, Jason. To what extent has this whole ramification of violence in the schools and shootings that we see nationwide impacted all of you as educational leaders?
Well, I think it's always, I've got 5 kids in school now. And so I think it's something that's always sitting in the back of your mind. When I was building principal in charge of a school of 1,000 kids and 300 prior to that, it's something that you're constantly dealing with. And I think trying to leverage every asset that you have in order to make schools safer, you should. Fortunately, I think you can work with your risk management plans and health, life, safety dollars and things to work with the physical space that you need to, which is a good thing. But beyond that, I think it's making sure you've got good relationships within your community with your local law enforcement, so that you know that you're in step with them, and that's not always the case.
Do you have the people, principals, and by law enforcement to come through to make sure they have a floor plan of the school?
Absolutely. Well, and we work with various vendors, that Navigate Prepared, I'll just put it on the table, is somebody that we've done that do a really nice job of providing 360 imaging of classrooms and then putting that stuff out there in a web-based system so that not only the school personnel have access to it, but then you also give law enforcement access to that as well. I will say this, though, Terry, since you brought that up, and we deal with safety issues. Obviously, Chicago is dealing with quite a run of different things that are both school-related and non-school related, but even the rural parts of the state are not immune to this. Mattoon, a few weeks back, dealt with a tough situation. A teacher really stepped in, saved the day, and their staff has done a superb job of dealing with the after effects of that as well. But I will say this, you start hearing the calls for, well, we need to arm every teacher in the school. I think those kinds of things are not the right solutions. I believe that every school needs a student resource officer, needs those high quality relationships with law enforcement, but more than anything else, we just need to make sure that educators have a great relationship with their students. And when you've got those kinds of things happening in schools, typically then if there is a problem, if there's a child that possibly could hurt other students or hurt themselves, when administrators and teachers are working well with their kids, typically another kid will inform principals and teachers of what's happening.
That came out in that before any shooting, it always turns out someone knew something,
Sure.
Or they certainly knew this kid was troubled or had some kind of a real issue.
And if the kid feels safe, like they can go tell an adult, that usually is the thing that will save the day.
Mike and Brent, let me kind of have you, to roll back, we talked about unfunded mandates or even just mandates. And so you all might, let's just say for the sake of discussion, say on school safety, hey, we agree we could have locks on the school doors or whatever you come up with. That's going to take some more money. To what extent, but it kind of goes back to maybe the lawmakers need to think, hey, if you put a mandate on, you're making me spend money in this pocket when I don't really need it, and then I don't have the money to put the money where it's absolutely needed, where there's a fire going on, right?
Well, absolutely. I mean, there's only a finite pile of resources, and so if you spend it on one thing, you can't spend it on another thing. And it's interesting, even in our conversations about the evidence-based model and what dollars can be counted and so forth, you can't count a pension obligation as dollars that could go into a classroom. So it's really important for people to understand that those finite dollars are being distributed among the needs of any system. And so if it's safety needs, if it's pension obligations, if it's other kinds of resource allocations that are needed to meet a mandate that's not part of your core mission, then those are going to take away from your core mission.
Let me, before Brent, that raises an interesting question. Is there any average, if I take a school budget, and they're going to vary all over the board as far as what their top line is, and I guess that would impact my question, but to what extent people go, well, we're spending so much in education. what percent of the money that we send to a school goes into the classroom versus, you know, your heating bill, your air conditioning bills, you say maybe paying for the school bus? I mean, these are enterprises, and there's a lot of money to keep those being run. So a lot of that money doesn't make its way to the classroom.
Can I interject, and I don't mean to
Sure,
step on
go ahead.
Mike here, but all of those dollars go to the classroom because everything that goes into that school impacts ultimately what's happening in that school. That's my editorial comment. Okay. It may not have been what you were looking for, but don't think that HVAC doesn't impact.
Heating, air conditioning.
Yes, doesn't impact what's going on in the classroom. It does.
Or school bus.
Well, for sure. I mean, keeping up your facilities matters. These guys.
But on the other hand, you might, I don't know if you are are you mandated to have a nurse at every school?
Mandated to have a school nurse within the system, and then you can have, you know, registered nurses that are less qualified in each school.
I might just say on a supposed basis that if I said to the four of you, if I untied your hands on mandates, you might all start spending money a little bit more directly where you think it's needed and not
Well,
necessarily.
it comes back to what Roger said. It's up to the local school board working with the community and administration and the teachers to make those decisions.
Or what works for them
Right.
locally.
There's a little bit of a misnomer on that too, that just because you relieve a mandate, that you're going to immediately eliminate that, because many mandates are in place because they are the right things to do. So, you know, I don't know, take it on the, you know, the safety side. Well, we're not going to pull out, you know, the AED machines from every, you know, sporting facility just because we're not mandated to have them there. We're going to have them there because that's a safety measure for anybody that comes into your building. So when a mandate goes in, it usually comes in under the idea that this is a good thing to do, but taking it out is very difficult. Even PE, you know, we got relief on PE in this last session, you know, so now it's only mandated for 3 days a week. But every student is in that building 5 days a week, so you still have to pay for the other 2 days, even if you reduce the PE time. So there's not necessarily a savings, direct savings from every mandate relief, but better local control gives you the options.
Well, it
to
gives
do
you
different things.
flexibility, and, you know, look, I can tell you that the price of AEDs are a lot higher than they were before they
Yeah.
were mandated. No matter what it is.
Yes,
Carbon
right.
monoxide detectors are more now,
Yeah.
because now they're mandated. So when I was a superintendent, and Brent, and I know Mike deals with this in his building, and Jason had, as a principal, insurance companies come around and do an inventory walkthrough of your building, and they count the number of chains and how high your swing sets are from the ground. And they leave you a list of things that they want you to fix in order to continue to have insurance coverage. There are all kinds of risk management things we do on a daily basis that aren't mandated by Springfield. They're not mandated by anyone, but if you're going to get a decent insurance rate or even coverage, you're going to do these lists of things that are safe for
Right,
kids.
right.
It doesn't take a mandate to do that. It just takes good management.
Common sense.
Common sense, and, you know, making sure you're doing what is best. And you do those things pre-mandate, and the products that are necessary in order to carry out those safety items are much less. Once they're mandated, price always goes up.
Well, gentlemen, I know we could talk a lot longer, but I'm going to let you go because you got other things to do, and we so appreciate you taking the time to speak with us. I think we covered a lot of issues in a relatively short amount of time, and just as you all just answered, a lot of times we don't hear beyond the headline, and when this is being covered just in the news media, so it's good to have this opportunity to hear a little bit more. So thank you again for joining us.
Thanks,
Thanks,
Gary.
Gary.